Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome to the Vantage Partners Executive Webinar Series this morning. My name is Christine Lee and I handle marketing for Vantage Partners. Before we begin, just some housekeeping items. We've muted the audio line here, but please feel free to use the chat box and any questions that come up anytime during this webinar. We'll be addressing as many questions as we can at the end of the session, so I'll go over those at the end of the session. Today's webinar is expected to run about 20 minutes or so we'll try to keep to that time schedule for you. And let's get started. So, our speaker today is Steve O'Deacon, Managing Director of Vantage Partners. Today's topic is the top 8 breakpoints in an executive search process, and I'm very pleased to introduce Steve today. He's one of the top thought leaders in the executive search industry. He has experience and expertise from nearly 2 decades of executive search, so he should be able to provide some really great insight for us today. Welcome, Steve.
Hey, thanks, Christine. It's great to be here, and welcome to all the viewers out there. As Christine said, I've been working in the retained search business for approximately 17 years. And throughout my career in this business, one of the constants has been trying to figure out how do we anticipate, recognize, and adapt to many of the hurdles that come our way when conducting a search. And so in today's webinar, I hope to highlight some of the most critical breakpoints that we've identified that can occur on an executive search process. And although I'm going to outline 8 in total, I thought I would try and make it a bit easier to follow if we group them into 3 distinct phases of search. So phase 1 is preparation for your search. And phase 2 we'll put in the market segmentation and engagement component of search. And then phase 3 is attracting and closing candidates. So along the way, I'll also touch on the impact of each one of these breakpoints and what that means to your search, and ideally how to proactively manage and mitigate those potential failures. I mean, we've all experienced top executive hiring and the multitude of ways an executive search can go sideways. And even under the best of circumstances, a mishire can unfold if the attention to detail to the fundamentals has not been done. So let's start with phase 1, preparing your search. In a typical search, most of us tend to go straight to outlining a position description first. And this isn't an illogical step, but there are a few steps that we advise that should precede the authoring of a PD, which leads us to the first breakpoint under preparing for a search. Breakpoint number 1 is what we call assessment failure. What do I mean by assessment failure, and what does that look like? Assessment failure means that you're starting with a poorly defined search criteria. It's often vague, could be unrealistic or irrelevant, or even an incomplete position requirement. All of these can lead to ineffective hiring. So let's start with an exercise. Let's take a look at your historical hiring and search for the symptoms that may point to assessment failure as the culprit. Symptoms might be the following. Maybe your candidates tend to be hired based on your team's superficial understanding of the role. Or the hiring process has been highly influenced by candidates' interpersonal strengths, while lacking those critical proof points of success that match the role. Or maybe your organization places an artificial bias for pedigree over substance, such as a bias towards a specific group or institution. Or potentially your interview team are basing assessment on gut feel alone. Now, we've all been there before. You've raised some yellow flags about a potential hire, but maybe your feedback was ignored or overshadowed by other compelling candidate attributes. And then 6 months later, you're firing that person. And when delivering with the hiring authority, the post-mortem, he says, but I used my gut feel. I had a good gut this hire was going to work out. Listen, gut is a good gauge when preceded by a disciplined approach to assessment. And it needs to be in that order. So how do you overcome this? Well, one example would be adopting what we call success factors. And success factors really attempts to go beyond the typical must-have list that are commonplace in our industry. They really define critical core competencies and candidate characteristics, and they outline your stated corporate goals and then align those to candidate proof points that will govern candidate assessment. and they ensure a consistent criteria set or yardstick for candidate evaluation. And truthfully, most importantly, they serve to unify the stakeholders who play a role in assessment. Now, in an ideal world, you'd want to limit your success factor list to 6 to 8 attributes that are critical drivers for the hire. And then once completed, share those with your team in writing so everyone's on the same page. So that takes us to breakpoint number 2 of phase 1. Breakpoint number 2 is the core mission for the role is unclear or not effectively communicated. The core mission is really the chief attractors, and let me emphasize that point again. The core mission are the chief attractors for top candidates, and is absolutely essential to assessing the fit, not only with respect to key competencies, but as to whether the candidate is ideally suited for the challenges that lie ahead in the journey. So how do you reveal the core mission? Well, I use what we call situation analysis. And a situation analysis is a 360-degree view of your business, and it uncovers the story behind your core mission. Important things like key talent matching qualities and compelling attributes unique to your company. But what it also will do is prepare you for how to address the market and answer likely candidate questions. Things like, what is your innovation and how is it unique? Or how is your company perceived in its category? Or what is your compelling vision or business goal that would actually intrigue a candidate, i.e., why should I join? And what characteristics define your corporate culture? Maybe you're wild and hip, maybe you're an innovator, a lifestyle company, maybe you're collegial. Whatever that is, you've got to identify that up front, and so on. So once you understand your uniqueness and your key company attributes, the core mission will fall in place. And then you can begin to message that opportunity effectively and qualify candidates based on the mission and their ambitions in addition to just experience and expertise. That brings us to breakpoint number 3, which is what we call stakeholder misalignment. Now, stakeholder misalignment happens when the search criteria are not well defined or understood by the interviewing team, or there's not full agreement on the prioritization of a search criteria or alignment as to which success factors or must-haves are critical for the search. Let me give you a short example of what this might look like. You have a CMO search. You sat down with your CEO, and he or she has a bias towards finding an executive who can help drive awareness and thought leadership. And maybe they're looking for an outward-facing presence in the role. Another stakeholder, such as the VP of Sales, may just focus on demand creation or lead generation, and the board may want it all. This is a very raw example of how stakeholders may have different priorities for a given search, but we've all been there in that mosh pit trying to serve everyone, and it's a difficult task. So how do we overcome this? Well, I find stakeholder misalignment often occurs later in a candidate's interview cycle. Most often we see this occur when a new influencer's interviewed the interview process. Although it's not limited to this scenario, that's where we see it most often. Using the raw example I used earlier, the search committee may have only consisted of the CEO, the recruiter, the VP of Sales. However, the interview team consists of a cross-functional group, all of the heads, the board, and potentially direct reports. In an ideal world, you'd want all the influencers to be engaged in the process. But for time reasons, it's just unrealistic. So the key to mitigating stakeholder misalignment is twofold. Really inform your team. Disseminate those success factors we talked about earlier as soon as they're complete and garner feedback immediately on the priorities. And then tweak where necessary. And the second is, prior to the interview happening, remind the interviewers of the key elements of the success factors and really get them to provide their feedback based on those 6 to 8 factors you've identified. This should help you eliminate the emotional buyer or I had a good gut syndrome. So the fourth and final breakpoint of phase 1 is having a contextual gap or poor corporate culture fit. What do I mean by this? Well, this occurs when the organizational landscape and history, corporate culture, critical goals, management style of the leadership team, or basic values of the organization are not well understood or communicated. And this is a tricky one to overcome, and it's also a top candidate killer. In addition, this is often an exercise of self-reflection, which makes it double difficult. Now, every company has a unique culture, and being cognizant of yours and communicating it will help ensure there's a great match. So step number one, you have to really identify and clearly communicate your organization's goals and values to candidates. And this may include sharing things like a 2-year corporate plan or an organizational landscape with candidates. You really want to present a well-planned company, which can be a huge selling point in the process. And if you want candidates to buy in, you need to invite them into your business. Next, you really want to prepare candidates with the knowledge to anticipate your perceived cultural uniquenesses and or nuances. I mean, this is a buy and sell orchestration, but you want to leave candidates with a positive impression versus having them walk away with 3 yellow flags regarding your culture. I mean, let's face it, no one likes surprises, so prepping candidates before they come in is a great recipe to follow. So that wraps up phase 1, preparing your search. A quick recap. Breakpoint number 1, assessment failure. Be sure to list out your success factors. Breakpoint number 2, the core mission is not understood. You really want to conduct a situation analysis which will reveal the mission. Breakpoint number 3, stakeholder misalignment. Get buy-in up front and drive feedback based on your success factors for the role. And breakpoint number 4, contextual gap or poor culture exists. Communicate your uniqueness and limit surprises. Okay, so let's move on to phase 2, market segmentation and engagement. Now that you've prepared your search, you need to figure out where you're going to hunt and how you're going to build a pipeline of star candidates. It's in this phase where we ID 2 more breakpoints. Breakpoint number 5 is poor market segmentation. Now, in the context of an executive search, poor market segmentation means the concept of the domain was not fully understood. Hey, the good news about this particular breakpoint is it's quick to rectify. The goal really is to uncover the market domains of interest or sandbox you intend to hunt. Unfortunately, domain is often simply characterized as your industry or a person's market or functional experience, but it can be much more. We use something we call the search ecosystem, and the search ecosystem is the industry map for the search, and it's determined by several factors that relate to the role's core mission and your business. Things like your company domain, your business model, your customer engagement approach, your specific technology arena, or your growth situation. A very simple illustration of how the ecosystem is shaped might be your company is considered today to be a social marketing platform business. That's your domain. And you sell your solution as a subscription. So that's your business model. And you sell your product services to the office of a CMO. That's your customer approach. And your technology enables your customers to make sense of large amounts of data, which is your tech arena. And your growth trajectory is to scale from 50 to 200 million in the next 3 years. With this type of map, rather than set in motion a search that targets just your immediate or neighboring competitors, your ecosystem map is now opened up to a number of possibilities, such as other vendors who sell to marketers, other vendors with a BI analytic or big data technology, SaaS players who have a different application but apply the same business model, or companies that are experiencing similar growth patterns to what you expect in the next 3 years. All or one of these segmentations will set your search ecosystem and direct really your go-to-market strategy for a given search. Where this breaks down is when your ecosystem won't support the desired selection of talent. So it's advisable to ID multiple points of interest to ensure broad market coverage. This is a great segue to breakpoint number 6, which is the candidate pool lacks critical mass. Now, what do I mean by this? Sometimes search criteria are overly ambitious and are overburdened with what we call the Swiss Army knife approach, which can often constrain the size of a pool of possible candidates. Now, we've all been there in the meetings. We've seen the white elephant position description or said after reviewing a role, there might be 3 people in the country that can do this. Well, the talent pool lacks critical mass may be one of the most common breakpoints for a search. And so how do you overcome this? Well, first you need to ask yourself, do the search criteria overly constrain the size of the pool of possible candidates? And this is usually pretty straightforward. But if you're not sure how to gauge the potential candidate pool size, use the 200 rule. The 200 rule means you need a talent market reach of approximately 200 touch points to build a pipeline of candidates, which will drive the desired examination of 7 to 10 viable candidates and ultimately deliver 1 to 2 finalists on average per search. Now, you want to keep in mind that 60% of your targets are going to have realistic binary constraints, precluding them from considering your role, leaving you with about 40 total candidates to consider. So once you've gone through that exercise, if you determine the candidate pool size is too small, go back and revisit your success factors. And possibly you're limiting the size by domain, size and scale, function, location, among others. So consider loosening on 1 or 2 of the and open your target pool. Keep in mind you want to avoid sacrificing any success factors that are core to achieving your stated business goals. You may even consider testing a smaller ecosystem, but we encourage you to have a backup plan to extend your reach if you're not seeing the desired results. So to conclude, phase 2, breakpoints that occur in market segmentation and engagement. To recap, breakpoint number 5 is poor market segmentation. Be sure to extend beyond market and functional domain to broaden your thinking around your target market. And breakpoint number 6, your candidate pool lacks critical mass. Follow the 200 rule to ensure a healthy pipeline of candidates can be surfaced. So we're in the final stretch, phase 3, attracting and closing candidates. This is where your preparation gets put to the test. Can you now attract and close your candidate of choice? And this leads us to breakpoint 7 and 8. Breakpoint 7 is the inability to attract top candidates. Now, this occurs when your initial pitch and value proposition are not compelling or stale, or the delivery of the pitch is weak. In this case, candidates will get turned off early, and many times there is no second chance with top-tier candidates. If the right strategies for persuasion are not in place, or the search team lacks that level of tenacity to pull top candidates out of comfortable situations, the search can suffer. So how do we overcome this? Well, first, you need to put your marketing hat on. You've done the hard work. You've built your success factors. You've completed your situation analysis. You've identified your market segments. Now crystallize the selling points identified in those exercises to build your storyboard for the search. The challenge here is balancing your natural passion and belief in your business with the reality that the outside world may not fully understand or appreciate your vision and goals or winning attributes. So again, you have to invite them in to discover that. So pending your market delivery device, email, phone, in person, you'll need to author your short form and long form stories. Remember, to pull star candidates out of their seats requires finesse. So your story should include the market story, which is the what factor, the technology or service story, which is the how factor, and the most important, which is the relevant story, which is the why factor. These days, candidates are inundated with opportunities, so your story should be unique and stand out. It's a great exercise to test your storyboard on others to garner feedback before going out into the market. The what, the how, the why storyboard are absolute critical ingredients to attracting top candidates. Finally, breakpoint number 8, a poorly orchestrated closing of top candidates. In the case of executive search, this can mean a poor plan is in place, or the lack of sharp and precise communication between the CEO and the search firm doesn't exist. And this can make closing top candidates difficult because they start to perceive a gap exists between the two parties. Inconsistencies or improper cadence of this particular process can quickly unhinge the deal. Top candidates make their career decisions based on the impact possibilities of the role, career potential of the move, the interpersonal chemistry between their boss and the team, and financial upside, in that order. So a lack of understanding of these priorities or not addressing each in a coordinated way may lead to poor conversion of top candidates. So how do you overcome this? Well, it begins with the first planning session with the team. You collectively establish a cadence for the search. It's supplemented by weekly update calls, debating and discussing progress. And as you develop candidates, you really want to anticipate what's to come next and ID those potential hurdles and establish checkpoints to test and validate interest and always be pre-closing. Along the way, you're seeding the search committee with the critical information required at each phase, all in preparation for a successful close. You want to be thinking 3 steps ahead, but be careful not to put the cart before the horse with respect to the natural selection process. Closing top candidates requires an engaged hiring authority, a tuned search professional, and a really buttoned-up, orchestrated process for ongoing communication. So that concludes our final phase, attracting and closing candidates. To recap, breakpoint number 7, inability to attract top candidates. Build your compelling storyboard up front. And number 8, a poorly orchestrated closing of top candidates. Anticipate next steps and always be pre-closing. So that wraps up this webinar on the 8 breakpoints of executive searches. You know, I'll stick around for questions, but before we start with the Q&A, Christine, I know I covered a lot of ground. You know, how are we doing on time?
Thanks, Steve. Thanks so much. I think we're doing good on time. We have a couple of minutes here, and we've got several questions. Before I address some of the questions from our audience, do you have any final words of wisdom to just wrap this all together?
Yeah, I'll be real quick here. You know, use these breakpoints as a starting point for the discussion rather than a prescriptive, rigid guide. And if you are using a search consultant, you know, let them guide you through the process. I mean, the best outcomes that I've seen are really born from strong partnerships where all the stakeholders and the search team itself are really working together in a partnership. And hopefully you can apply some of these principles in your next search or next project, and I wish you all the best of luck.
Okay, great. Thanks, Steve. Okay, we've gotten a lot of questions along the way, so let me see if I can group a couple of these together. We won't be able to get to everybody, so if I didn't get to your question, we'll see if we can address some of these individually, perhaps after the session. Let me see if I can pick maybe 3 of them for this webinar. Okay, one viewer is interested in knowing, and I'll paraphrase a little here, how do you go about tracking candidate progress and making sure you get timely feedback from the interviewing team?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one we get often. You know, tracking candidates internally, in our opinion, goes beyond the HR department or recruiter. I mean, you got to remember that this market is highly competitive. So if stakeholders aren't communicating and the process stalls, you could really lose a top prospect. So, you know, candidates are looking for a team that knows what they want. And they can always accept the go, no-go. But if feedback is delayed, that can potentially convey the wrong message and really stall momentum. To remedy this, you know, we'd like to ensure that all stakeholders are given, you know, incentives for timely feedback. Ideally, they're using the same tools to convey that input. And when submitting their feedback, going back up to success factors, I would request that they frame that candidate feedback or assessment using those 6 to 8 success factors of interest to remove any ambiguity of the feedback itself.
Okay, great. This sounds great. Another question that we have, and this is probably a very common one you get often, how have professional networks like LinkedIn changed the game for executive hiring?
Yeah, we do get that question often. And you know, LinkedIn and all the other social networks, but I'll use LinkedIn because it's so closely aligned with what we do. You know, they've been around now for almost a decade. So, you know, the topic's a little bit common these days. I mean, I think the biggest impact that they've had is around accessibility. They've really commoditized the talent access and have really made it easy for everyone to extend their reach. Not to date myself, but I can recall in the 90s where, you know, access was the leading differentiator among search firms. But as access has become more ubiquitous, it's influenced many adaptations in our immediate industry, and I suspect, has impacted many of our viewers in some way, shape, or form when they're conducting a search. In many ways, these network services have had a very positive influence on executive hiring. From candidate referencing has been, much easier. Searching and using expertise tagging has helped uncover candidates and their specialties. And certainly the need for resumes has certainly been subtly diminished by the online profile or resume, and a number of others. For us, we incorporate not only LinkedIn, but a bevy of tools in these networks, and we've integrated them into our daily work where appropriate. So they've been great. I mean, there's certainly some downsides that I won't go into here, but, the positives far outweigh some of the negatives that we see in executive hiring.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Steve. Let's take one more question here, and this is probably one that a lot of companies out there struggle with. When's the right time to enlist the help of an outside firm to facilitate a search?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's probably likely going to be situation specific. What I might advise you to do is start by asking some basic internal questions as a baseline. Is the timing of this hire going to be mission critical or needle moving? And can your business afford any risks of delay? The second question might be, are you confident that the resources you have internally can tell your story, can drive a tight process, and can effectively communicate that to the talent market? And maybe the third would be looking at any internal sensitivities that might be in play that could derail your ability to manage your search effectively. And after reviewing some of these internal questions, if your confidence remains high and your organization has built a really solid hiring platform, then enlisting outside help may be a last resort. That said, selfishly I'll say, if and when you do enlist outside support, be realistic about the timeline and your expectations. Keep in mind that an average executive search takes 75 to 120 days, or approximately about a quarter. So you want to bake that into your planning cycles when determining, when to use outside search partners. Our preference is to get in as early as possible in advance of the need to be in place so that we can do our job effectively. So that would be how I'd answer that question.
Okay, good. Very good point. I think we are coming towards the end of our session here. Wanted to thank you so much, Steve. And for our viewers, this concludes the Vantage Partners Executive Webinar for today. But thank you, Steve O'Degan of Vantage Partners, on the topic of the top 8 breakpoints of executive search. We provided Steve's contact information here on the slide, and we'll provide all of you after this webinar a link to the recording if you'd like to review any of the information, and also Steve's info again over email for any further questions or discussions you'd like to have about overcoming some of the top challenges of executive search. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thanks all.